March 12, 1943. London, England. The morning air was thick with the soot of yesterday's raids, and the streets still hummed with the distant echo of anti-aircraft guns. In a narrow classroom above a shuttered bakery in East London, 16-year-old Mary sat on a wooden stool, her legs swinging slightly above the cold floorboards. The blackboard in front of her was smudged with chalk dust from lessons past, and yet it now bore a new kind of drawing, lines and dots that seemed to pulse with silent urgency. To anyone else, it looked like a game, a whimsical chart of unfamiliar landscapes. But to Mary, each line represented something very real. German airfields, the crisscrossing of runways, the placement of hangars, and the ever-changing positions of anti-aircraft guns. Her pencil hovered above the notebook at her side, though she barely needed it. She worked entirely from memory, sketching what she had heard on intercepted broadcasts and pieced together from fragmented reports she had scavenged. Teachers had long dismissed her quiet obsession as childish fascination, something to be encouraged for its neatness rather than its content. But Mary had a mind that thrived on patterns, on the invisible threads that tied intelligence together. She had no formal training. She had no clearance. And yet, somehow, she knew more about enemy deployments than many men twice her age, men whose offices were stacked with maps, confidential cables, and layers of bureaucracy. The classroom smelled of chalk and damp wood, of yesterday's coal fires that had yet to fully die. Outside, the city carried on under the uneasy rhythm of wartime life. A milkman's cart rattled along the cobblestones, punctuated by the occasional shriek of an air raid siren from somewhere far beyond the horizon. Mary hardly noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, tracing invisible lines from Berlin to the French coast, from northern Germany to the edges of occupied Norway. Each dot she placed on the board represented not merely a location, but a potential strike, a possible target, a threat waiting to descend on a city that might never even know it had been saved. Her hands moved quickly now, almost instinctively, as if the act of drawing was itself a form of breathing. She paused for a moment, frowning, thinking of a report she had overheard in a crowded tube station the day before, a hurried conversation between two soldiers about a newly expanded airstrip near Hamburg. She corrected her map, adding a subtle cross, a notation only she would understand. The contradiction gnawed at her. She was a schoolgirl, one who still had to memorize multiplication tables and study Shakespeare. Yet in this narrow classroom, she was doing work that intelligence officers would kill to see executed correctly. She chuckled softly, a nervous, almost guilty sound. It was absurd, almost comic, to think that someone like her could hold knowledge that powerful men could not. And yet it was true. The sound of footsteps in the corridor startled her. She froze, chalk poised midair. Her teacher, a stern woman with a habit of draping her cardigan over her shoulders in the morning chill, peered through the doorway. "Mary, what on earth are you doing now?" she asked, voice threaded with curiosity and irritation. Mary looked up, meeting the teacher's gaze. "I'm just drawing," she said, deliberately vague. The teacher stepped inside, squinting at the blackboard, frowning at the intricate lines. "Drawing? That looks complicated," she admitted, a touch of unease creeping into her voice. "It's just maps," Mary said quietly. "I like maps." The teacher left shortly after, shaking her head, muttering something about peculiar hobbies. The moment the door clicked shut, Mary returned to her work, but now a new tension had settled over her. She knew the stakes. Every dot, every line she drew could be vital. Every mistake could have consequences far beyond a mere schoolyard failure. And yet, she also knew that the world outside these walls might never recognize what she was doing. There would be no medals, no applause. Perhaps no one would even remember her contribution at all. That thought should have been discouraging, but instead it made her move faster, more precise, her chalk scratching across the board like the beat of a determined heart. She remembered the first time she had attempted this, how she had overheard a radio broadcast about Luftwaffe movements and had, out of curiosity, traced the locations in her notebook. The lines didn't make sense at first. She had drawn runways that didn't exist, markings that seemed arbitrary. But over weeks, her observations had grown sharper. She had memorized not only the locations but the patterns, the rotations, the subtle shifts in deployment. Soon, she could reproduce entire networks from memory, a feat that even experienced intelligence officers found remarkable. And yet, she was just a girl, and the paradox of her life lay in the tension between her youth and the weight of knowledge she carried. The classroom window rattled suddenly as a plane droned overhead. Mary didn't look up. She imagined the same aircraft flying over the field she had marked the night before, invisible to everyone, yet somehow anticipated in her mind. Each flight path she could visualize, each hangar she could point to without a map in front of her. It was as if she had stitched together the world in her head, a silent cartographer whose maps existed only in memory. And she wondered, for the first time, whether anyone else could see it. Whether anyone else would understand the quiet genius of what she was doing in this small, unremarkable classroom. The knocking came softly at first, almost hesitant. Mary's head snapped toward the door. Her heart pounded. The classroom door opened a fraction, revealing a man in a trench coat, his eyes scanning the room with careful calculation. He wasn't her teacher. He wasn't a parent. He was something else entirely, someone who had come looking for her. Mary's breath caught. She didn't yet understand the full danger, but she felt it instinctively. The chalk in her hand suddenly seemed heavier, the blackboard larger, the walls smaller. "You're Mary, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice low but certain. Mary nodded, unsure what she had done to merit this attention. "We've heard about your work," he continued, producing a folded paper from his coat. "We think you can help us." He didn't explain who he was, or how much he knew, but in that moment, Mary understood the gravity of her hidden talent. The quiet thrill of her secret now carried the weight of responsibility. The man left a note on the desk before disappearing into the hallway. Mary stared at it, trembling slightly. It contained coordinates, a time, a meeting place, clues that promised to pull her out of the safety of the classroom and into a world she had only observed from the edges. Her hands hovered over the chalk, over the map she had drawn from memory, and she felt the paradox that had defined her life so far. The world needed what she alone could provide, yet she was still a girl who had once struggled with fractions and handwriting. And for the first time, she asked herself a question she would carry for the rest of her life. If a schoolgirl could know so much, what did that say about the men who did not? Outside, the city held its breath. Inside, a chalk-stained hand hesitated over the blackboard, tracing a line that would change everything. April 7th, 1943. Bletchley Park, England. The estate sat hidden among the rolling fields, its stately Victorian facade belying the frantic intelligence work within. The air was damp and smelled faintly of wet earth and ink. Mary's boots clicked on the stone path as she approached the main building, the chill of spring brushing against her face. She clutched a small satchel, its contents modest, a notebook, a pencil, and the map she had drawn countless times from memory. Every step toward the gate felt unreal. She was still 16, still a schoolgirl in a world that had only ever known her as quiet, polite, unremarkable. And yet here she was, about to enter the heart of Britain's wartime intelligence, a place where the nation's fate was weighed on paper and in whispers. The gates opened for her before she could reach them. Inside, a labyrinth of corridors stretched like veins, each lined with rooms where men and women hunched over desks piled with coded messages, crumpled maps, and the hum of electric typewriters. The air vibrated with a tension Mary had never known outside of air raid sirens and the distant roar of planes overhead. She felt exposed, her youth and small frame making her seem fragile, almost out of place among the meticulous chaos of seasoned codebreakers. A man in a gray suit approached, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp. "Mary," he said simply, as though the name alone carried weight. "We've been expecting you." Inside one of the larger rooms, she was introduced to a cluster of officers who studied her with polite skepticism. Men and women with stern expressions, their hands stained with ink and their minds apparently weighed down by codes too complex for ordinary understanding. She felt the paradox immediately. Here she was, barely able to vote, facing a room full of adults trained in strategy and intelligence, yet they were looking to her for insight. Her maps, her mental reconstructions of enemy airfields, were to become an instrument of action. "Show us what you've done," one of the officers finally said, gesturing to a blank table. Mary nodded and carefully unrolled her notebook. She began to trace the airfields from memory, her pencil moving with fluid precision, each line deliberate, each mark purposeful. She spoke softly, describing the orientation of runways, the placement of hangars, the natural camouflage that hid some fields from reconnaissance flights. The room grew quiet. Officers exchanged glances. She had expected curiosity, perhaps polite interest, but not the astonishment that was beginning to ripple through the group. One officer leaned in closer, pointing to a cluster of dots near northern France. "Are you certain?" he asked, his tone measured, skeptical. Mary nodded without hesitation. "Yes. There are 3 hangars here, aligned northeast to southwest, with anti-aircraft positions at each corner. The second runway is extended by 30 meters, probably to accommodate the new bombers they're moving in from Hamburg." Her voice was steady, but her heart raced. She could see the calculation in their eyes, the disbelief slowly turning into reluctant trust. The paradox of her existence pressed in again. A child, a student, offering intelligence that could save thousands. Yet here she was treated with cautious deference, as though her youth should render her incapable of insight. And yet, she was right. Every detail she traced from memory would later be confirmed through aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and reports from agents in occupied Europe. Her maps were not mere guesses. They were living documents, a mental choreography of enemy activity that few could replicate. Hours passed. Mary moved from one table to another, overlaying her sketches onto official maps, explaining patterns and probabilities. She described how German planes rotated bases every fortnight, how supply trucks followed hidden routes along canals, how certain decoy airfields were nothing more than painted runways designed to mislead Allied reconnaissance. She saw officers scribbling notes furiously, their faces pale with the realization of what she had accomplished. Each revelation was a minor triumph, each correction a step toward preventing potential disaster. But it wasn't only her accuracy that impressed them, it was her audacity. She challenged assumptions that had gone unquestioned for months. Where generals had relied on routine reports and bureaucratic habit, Mary relied on observation, intuition, and memory. She saw patterns in what others considered random, uncovered inconsistencies that had been overlooked, and pushed against the inertia of institutional thought. There was tension in the room, a quiet storm of disbelief and admiration. She was not just contributing information. She was forcing adults trained in strategy to reconsider everything they thought they knew. By evening, a sense of cautious optimism settled over the room. The officers had begun drafting operational plans based on her maps, their usual cautious language giving way to actionable directives. Mary was exhausted, but exhilarated. She had stepped into a world far beyond her years, a world where a pencil and memory could rival machines and trained analysts. And yet, the weight of responsibility was undeniable. Each decision influenced by her maps could mean the difference between life and death for pilots, ground crews, and entire cities. She had entered the intelligence apparatus as a student, but she now carried the burden of an operative. Later that night, in a dimly lit dormitory room converted from an old servant's quarters, Mary sat alone with her notebook. The sounds of typewriters and murmured conversations drifted through the walls. She traced her finger over the lines she had drawn earlier, remembering each detail, each observation that had guided the day's decisions. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. A young woman, perhaps a few years older than Mary, slipped inside. "You did well today," she said, her voice gentle but tinged with awe. "They don't usually trust someone your age, but you made them listen." Mary smiled faintly. The acknowledgement was small, but it mattered. Yet even in that quiet moment, doubt lingered. Could the world really accept the idea that a schoolgirl had played a part in shaping wartime strategy? Could it ever understand that her contribution, though critical, would remain invisible, classified, and unacknowledged? The tension of invisibility pressed down on her. Victory was possible, but recognition was not. And in that paradox, Mary felt both triumph and isolation, the duality of a young mind thrust into the machinery of war. Outside, the estate was silent under the starless sky, the fields stretching dark and unbroken. Inside, plans were unfolding that would alter the course of operations over Northern Europe, plans guided in part by memory, by intuition, by a girl who had once simply liked drawing maps. She leaned back on her cot, closed her eyes, and imagined the planes flying over the airfield she had traced, each one now a little less unpredictable, a little less lethal because of her knowledge. And she wondered, with the quiet intensity of someone too young to fully grasp the consequences, if her memory could shape outcomes in a war so vast, how many other hidden minds, untrained and unrecognized, were quietly shaping history elsewhere? The thought was both humbling and terrifying. The night deepened. Mary traced her maps once more, knowing that tomorrow would demand more observation, more deduction, more courage. She was no longer merely a schoolgirl with a pencil. She was a human instrument of strategy, a mind alone capable of seeing patterns that institutions had overlooked. And the paradox lingered. She was saving lives while the world remained unaware, her triumph hidden beneath layers of secrecy and bureaucracy, her youth both a shield and a limitation. September 1945. Post-war London. The city carried the quiet scars of victory. Crumbled buildings patched with timber, streets still marred by bomb craters, and the air heavy with the faint smell of smoke and damp earth. Victory had come, but it was not the jubilant, cinematic celebration that Mary had imagined as a child. It was quieter, more introspective, marked by relief and a lingering sense of loss. She walked through the streets with her coat pulled tightly around her, her notebook long packed away, tucked beneath layers of secrecy that no one outside Bletchley Park would ever fully understand. The war had ended months before, yet Mary's contribution remained invisible, locked in the confidential vaults of intelligence reports. No medals had been offered. No public recognition had arrived. Even her closest supervisors spoke of her achievements only in private, careful to maintain the secrecy that had protected operations during the war. And so Mary wandered, a ghost among survivors, knowing that her maps, the mental cartography she had painstakingly drawn from memory, had guided raids, prevented ambushes, and saved countless lives. Yet the paradox lingered. A schoolgirl had altered the course of events in a conflict that shaped the world, and no one outside those walls would ever know. She paused outside a shuttered classroom in East London, the very room where it had all begun. The blackboard was still there, dust-coated and cracked from years of neglect. Her fingers hovered over the faint chalk marks left behind, a silent testament to the intelligence she had wielded. She remembered the first time she had drawn enemy airfields, the fear and exhilaration that had accompanied each correct detail, and the quiet triumph of knowing she had outsmarted generals from the seat of her stool. Standing there now, the room seemed smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of memory. The chalk lines were gone, erased long ago, but she could still see them in her mind's eye. Mary thought of the young officers at Bletchley Park, the codebreakers who had looked at her with disbelief and then with cautious trust. She thought of the night raids guided by her sketches, the pilots who never knew a schoolgirl had helped plot a safer path for them, the lives that had been spared silently. The paradox of heroism struck her with renewed intensity. To be instrumental and invisible, powerful and unrecognized, clever and constrained by secrecy. She felt the moral weight of it, a quiet ache that no public accolade could ever soothe. Her life outside intelligence had resumed the normal rhythms of post-war adolescence, but normalcy felt hollow. Friends spoke of dances and university plans while she carried memories of hidden maps, coded telegrams, and intercepted messages. It was a strange existence, celebrating freedom while holding the intimate knowledge of wartime horrors. Mary knew that the world had moved on, that history books would list victories and battles without mentioning her name, and yet the knowledge of her role remained her own. It was a private triumph, bittersweet in its solitude. One afternoon, she returned to the quiet of her bedroom, sitting at a small desk with the windows open to the autumn light. She traced imaginary maps across the tabletop, lines connecting airfields, routes, and hidden supply chains. The repetition was comforting, a ritual that allowed her to relive the moments of clarity and focus that had defined her wartime work. And then she paused, realizing that what had once been a secret game, a private obsession, had become a defining feature of her identity. She was no longer merely a student. She was a witness to history, a silent architect of outcomes whose consequences were felt far beyond her understanding.